very, very happy that Jason was with us here today. He was one of the persons that was supporting the idea from the very beginning, giving ideas and saying this is something really good, we have to do that. So I want to say thank you, Jason. And we will be with Jason today the whole day. So after lunch, we will continue discussing the issues that he will deal with during the presentation. And then we will have another session, right? So the idea we were discussing here that is we own the course together. I mean, this was my idea, but the idea is that if we want to make some changes, for example, to go to another place to discuss with Jason, we do that, right? I mean, we have to create this feeling of the common, right here. So please, Jason, welcome, and now it's your time, right?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. How exciting to be here with all of you today in the midst of, as Christian was telling me, you already have been discussing this, in the midst of a global revolt against finance capital and the austerity measures that are being imposed on working and poor people worldwide. It's very clear that we are at a turning point, certainly of neoliberalism as an era of capitalism. That turning point I will call a signal crisis. That is, it signals the end, but neoliberalism in some sense is still with us, dead, but still dominant. And so what I want to highlight today as a series of provocations for future discussions later this morning and for the rest of our meetings in this course, and for those of you who are staying into the land grab workshop on Friday. So the title that I gave Christian is Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital. Most of what I will be talking about today is neoliberalism and the end of cheap food as the end of historical capitalism. And I will try to elaborate some of the central ideas and guiding threads of this project in so doing. So what I want to do is to begin with two big questions, and they're very simple. The first is, if neoliberalism is in crisis, what kind of crisis is it? And second, how does a broadly political ecology or production of nature perspective reshape our understanding of neoliberalism and the previous crises in historical capitalism, going back to the long 16th century? Well, what we have today on the left is this great divide between very creative and perceptive accounts of the so-called economic crisis and very perceptive and dynamic accounts of some of the so-called ecological crisis. And what's missing is an account that draws out the interrelations between the two, that understands the food crisis, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, the energy crisis, so on and so forth, as expressions of an underlying breakdown in what I would call the value relations that were organized under neoliberal capitalism. Now, right away, what do we mean by value relations? Well, here I go back to Marx, and I differ from somebody like John Bellamy Foster, who doesn't understand that there is actually an interrelation between the environmental crisis and the crisis of accumulation. Value, in Marx's hands, was a way of naming the socio-ecological relationality, negotiations, and conflicts over how nature as a whole is organized. Now, nature as a whole includes human nature. And crucial to my argument is that we view capitalism as a world ecology. And I'll explain what I mean by this. For those of you who are taking notes, there's a hyphen in between world and ecology. What I mean by capitalism as world ecology is that capitalism is a way of organizing the relations of all nature on this planet that finds its gravitational center in endless commodification. So that's not the whole story, but it's a big part of the story. Now, what this means is that capitalism is not an economic system. Capitalism is not a social system. Capitalism is a way of organizing all nature, and the crucial tension is between commodification, the zones of commodity circulation, of production, of exchange on the one hand, and the totality of the conditions of socio-ecological reproduction on the other hand. Okay, so you have this tension between the conditions of reproduction that are not commodified and the zones of commodification on the other hand. And what capitalism has done historically is to advance the commodity frontier into the zones of socio-ecological reproduction. This includes not just the health and well-being of forests and soils and streams and the atmosphere, but also the relations between human beings, the patterns of family formation, the patterns of imperialism, of world market construction, and so on and so forth. So value, to return to this sort of common deep logic of capitalism, and when I say deep logic, I mean this in a dialectical sense, not in a determining sense, okay? That in the sense that we can't think of capitalism in any non-arbitrary way without understanding the centrality of value relations. What's at the heart of value relations? Well, in one sense, it is value. Marx uses value in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to try to tease these out. And this is very much a dialogue with a lot of work that's going on today, and we can talk about this in more detail. But value is in one sense what Marx calls abstract social labor or socially necessary labor time. That is, capitalism treats labor productivity as the essence of all wealth. Now, I'm going to explain how this relates to the rest of nature in a moment. And value, we might think of value as the average amount of social labor embedded in the average commodity. Now, implied in value relations are a whole series of dialectical tensions between the owners of capital and those without capital who must work for a living, so between bourgeois and proletarian. It has to do with the, so it's also a sociological category. It's also an ecological category in terms of the tension between the natural distinctiveness of any particular commodity, this chair for instance, and its economic equivalence. That is, when a capitalist produces a chair, he or she isn't concerned about the chair. He or she is concerned about minimizing the labor that's embedded in that chair so that he or she can be competitive on a world market. Economic equivalence, Marx's abstract social labor, is what's in there. Okay, well, what does this have to do with landscape transformation? And a lot of what I'm saying grows out of two decades-long engagements. One is with the history of capitalism as an ecological regime. And I can't emphasize this point enough. The capitalism does not possess an ecological regime alongside all these other regimes, resource regimes, energy regimes. Rather, capitalism is in itself an ecological regime. Then we have more specific manifestations of this. Phil McMichael will be coming here tomorrow. We have food regimes, we have resource regimes, we have all of these other ways of looking at how the modern world is organized. But if we don't understand that at its core, all this sort of major interdependent master processes, this is Charles Tilly's great phrase, we have all these great sort of prime movers of modernity, state formation, world markets, the rise and demise of successive racial orders, of colonialism and decolonization, and so on and so forth. The Occupy Wall Street movement today is an argument about how the relations between humans and the rest of nature should be formulated. So what I am saying is that when we look at these big processes of financialization, of accumulation, of uneven development, these are not social processes that then go out and make their footprint and slip, if you're in the mud, make their footprint in the rest of nature. Rather, these are socio-ecological projects and processes in their own right. Wall Street is a way of organizing nature, okay? So what this means is that we look at these big processes as bundles of human and extra-human nature. Now, why are we doing it in this way? Because this allows for a deeper, more fundamental, more radical in the sense of going to the root of a problem, analysis of what's going on today. We have a whole series of analyses of the economic crisis that say the problem is overaccumulation, the problem is insufficient regulation of finance capital, the problem is this or that. And we have a whole series of ecological analyses, but what we're not seeing is how they all fit together. So what I will try to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to talk a bit about, about the end of cheap food. And of course, cheap food isn't the only thing that we're seeing the end of. The end of cheap energy, of course. People want to talk about peak oil, and I'll mention why that's a problem in a moment. We have essentially four big inputs that are crucial from the perspective of capital, that are crucial to make cheaper. They are labor power, food. The connection is very, very tight between the price of food and the price of labor power. Energy and raw materials. What's striking today is that after the longest, widest in scope, most durable, and most volatile commodity boom of the 20th century, between 2003 and 2008, you remember in 2008 when everybody was talking about the food crisis in a massive way. Well, guess what? The commodity boom is still with us. If you look at the IMF's commodity price index for all the major commodities, they are at or close to the peak of 2008. And of course, as a footnote, the prices in much of the world, especially in the global south for food, never got cheaper after 2008. Okay, so here's the big question, and we can debate about it a lot in the hours, in the rest of the day's time that we have. But where does neoliberalism go from here? Where does capitalism go from here? What are the necessary conditions for a revival of accumulation? So what I do is I ask three questions. I say, what's the long run trend? And by long run, I mean the durée of historical capitalism, back to the long 16th century. So I look at how do we see long-term trends play out? Landscape transformation, the proletarianization of labor, the development of state power, so on and so forth. Then I ask, well, what are the cyclical movements? How do we see successive phases of, name your favorite topic, imperialism, scientific revolutions, accumulation, and so forth. And it is only on this basis, once we ask what is cumulative, what is cyclical, that we can begin to ask, well, what's really new here? So it is in this spirit that I'm going to talk about the end of cheap food and the future of capitalism. So historically, what we know is that the resolution of successive Great Depressions over the history of capitalism, and no doubt about it, we are in the midst of a Great Depression on a world scale. The closest empirical reference to this would probably be the late 19th century, although I am tempted to say that it is closer to the crisis of feudalism in the long 14th century, for reasons we can talk about more later. The crucial condition for the resolution of these great accumulation crises, these Great Depressions, has been the World-Ecological revolutions that create new sources of windfall profits. The key to these windfall profits are what I call the four chiefs: labor, food, energy, and raw materials. And these are the core of the World-Ecological surplus. Again, World-Ecological with a hyphen. It is a surplus not in a demographic sense. This is the neo-Malthusian perspective of ecological footprint studies, okay? It's not that. It's not in relation to the number of people on the planet, which is a much more complicated and thorny set of questions than much of the discourse, especially much of the green discourse, would have it. But it is a surplus. The ecological surplus is a surplus relative to the average cost of production prevailing within capitalism as a whole. These take many forms, but are ultimately rooted in the productivity of labor. Okay, Marx once observed, and I haven't ever seen anyone deal with this, Marx once observed that the fertility of the soil could act like an increase of fixed capital being machinery. without all the nasty side effects of rising capital intensity, like the falling rate of profit. So what I'm saying is, in effect, that Marx's observation holds for the long history of enclosure and the exhaustion of forests, peat bogs, oil fields, coal fields, aquifers, peasant societies, and so forth. Cheap food is especially crucial, as I've indicated, as it is strongly related to the price of labor in commodity production. So when I say cheap food, it's not cheap for everyone. Okay, the great sort of dynamism of historical capitalism rests on this really this extraordinary accomplishment, which was, on the one hand, in successive eras to dramatically enlarge the world proletariat, and on the other, to dramatically drive down the cost of food. So, in contrast to the late 19th century, when world grain prices fell by 27%, we are looking today at very sharp increases in the price of food for the world's working classes. This is related to financialization in all sorts of interesting ways. And in fact, in contrast again to the late 19th century, finance capital is now expropriating not only the rest of humanity, but the rest of capital, in an effort to sustain a finance-led, a kind of finance hegemony over the accumulation process as a whole. So it's important that we understand that the end of cheap food and energy and raw materials and so forth is not a simple matter of resource depletion. Now, there is something that we can call resource depletion that we need to think about. However, what we need to look at are the overall conditions through which the four cheaps, labor, food, energy, and raw materials, and yes, labor is still cheap, the underlying conditions through which these big four inputs are delivered to capital as a whole. So, back to the ecological surplus. The ecological surplus is basically a shorthand for how capital seizes upon the free gifts of nature. This was Marx's very critical term for how capital appropriated the rest of nature. It's sometimes read in very different ways, which is entirely wrong. But this is a way of talking about how capital appropriates free gifts of nature. This is one of the really central ways that accumulation has proceeded. Over the centuries, one of the key things that capital wants is to set forth a very little amount of capital to get a very large amount of nature's free gifts. So in the 17th century, for instance, this was done by Dutch capital bringing African slaves, appropriated at very low cost, bringing them to northeastern Brazil to cultivate sugar on plantations that were financed by through the Amsterdam Bourse, the stock market of the time, the Wall Street of its day. And you could combine very cheap labor, very fertile soils, very abundant forests, which means the price of the labor costs of extracting fuel were very low. You could put these all together and produce a great boom. Now, of course, as always, the boom turns bust. What I am saying is that this is not merely a story of the 17th century. We could tell the same story about energy and capital-intensive agriculture in the long 20th century. What's happening today in the very heartlands of world agriculture is the progressive exhaustion of the bases of the boom that fueled the long 20th century. The end of cheap water, the exhaustion of the soils, the end of cheap energy. Energy prices are about twice on average what they were in the early part of the past decade. Yes, gas is cheap for the moment, but only for the moment, because fracking is going to catch up with the process in all sorts of interesting ways. So this ecological surplus is a way of saying that there is a very small amount of capital, which includes the concept of labor, in the appropriation of very large amounts of nature's free gifts. And what's been happening over the past 40 years is that the opportunities for accumulating by appropriation have dramatically narrowed, even as the need for such appropriations have become much bigger. And this gives us a certain kind of clue to what's been going on with neoliberalism. One part of what's been going on with neoliberalism is an unprecedented form of financialization. Now, financialization has been with us since the age of the Genoese in the 16th and 17th centuries. There has, in some sense, been finance capital even before that. Finance capital as a concept was developed by the German Marxist Hilferding, who rightly identified a certain process by which banking capital was becoming more and more like industrial capital. But what's happening today is the exact opposite of that. What's been happening indeed since the 1970s is the exact opposite of that. Industrial firms and all manner of wholesale retail firms, all manner of capitalist activity is becoming more and more like finance capital. And finance capital has developed its hegemony not only through a sort of moral vision of shareholder value and so forth, but also through a very strong disciplinary apparatus, partly operating through the bond markets and securities markets themselves, and partly, of course, through old-fashioned primitive accumulation and the return of the most violent, the most ruthless forms of state repression, state surveillance. And so this is one key to the process. We see financialization interweaving itself in all our daily lives as never before in the history of capitalism. Forming, among other things, if you look at places especially like North America, what some have called a creditariat. That is, you have the sort of generalization of debt peonage relations throughout the working class, where credit relations are a means of become a survival strategy for working class households, and also a disciplining mechanism, of course. The end of the really big frontiers of appropriation in the neoliberal era, and there were a few. We can think of, say, North Sea, Alaskan oil, West African oil. We can look at the extraordinary dispossessions of the Chinese peasantry, especially from the late 1970s, and then the agrarian reforms in the early 80s. We've seen the massive proletarianization of East Asian labor, and the East Asian working classes have expanded from about 100 to 900 million over the neoliberal period. That we see the sort of faltering of this appropriation, accumulation by appropriation in the old-fashioned ways of incorporating vast new continents, as we saw in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where South Asia was brought in a major way, where the vast resources of the North American continent were brought into the mix, where the prowess of American agriculture effectively dislocated tens of millions of Eastern European peasants who then came to the Americas, also to Latin America, to fuel industrialization. So those opportunities in the neoliberal era were much more constrained than ever before, those opportunities for accumulation by appropriation. And as a result, we saw a progressive slowdown in labor productivity. Now, in labor productivity growth. Now, labor productivity, because the accumulation of capital is the accumulation of value, which is abstract social labor, because the real basis for accumulation in capital is labor productivity, not land productivity. That's why capitalism tears through the relations and the landscapes of the extra-human world so fast. Is because labor productivity is so key that the exhaustion of those opportunities for appropriating extra-human nature fed directly into the exact opposite of what was widely anticipated in the 1970s. Instead of automated factories and robotization and another great leap forward in labor productivity, we saw exactly the opposite. We saw the sweatshopization of the world. And this could occur because you have a situation even today where, say, the average wage of Chinese workers is about 5% of what it is of American workers. You could essentially organize production on a labor-intensive basis, but increase the rate of exploitation by suppressing consumption. Of course, this flies directly in the face of the conventional wisdom of environmental thought, that the problem is too much consumption. In fact, the neoliberal era has been characterized by a radical suppression of consumption, by what Farshad Aragi calls forced underconsumption. That we look at the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, but also elsewhere, where the consumption of food, of energy, of all manner of other sort of vital necessaries of life has been drastically suppressed. We have a situation today where somewhere in the ballpark of 3 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies in their diet, or much worse. So 3 billion, close to half of the world's population. And we can also see it in the global north, where, for instance, in the United States, household income, working class household income has stagnated for the past 40 years, despite the addition of another worker in each household. That is the proletarianization of women. This was a major boom, capital appropriating the free gifts of human nature, in this case, by drawing in the uncommodified labor power of American women after the post-World War II boom. So again, we have this tension between commodification and uncommodified reproductive labor in various ways. This is very crucial. So, and then finally, I would just highlight the paradox of so-called accumulation by dispossession, or what I prefer to call primitive accumulation, in the neoliberal era. Never before in the history of capitalism has primitive accumulation been so penetrating, so ruthless, so totalizing in its ambition. I think Naomi Klein's sort of metaphor of the shock doctrine and the torture chamber as the sort of metaphor of neoliberal primitive accumulation is really instructive. That we have seen all manner of new enclosures, of biopiracy. In fact, most of the lexicon, the conceptual vocabulary of radicals for talking about neoliberalism highlights its redistributionary character. And so never before has primitive accumulation been so violent, so ruthless, so savage, and yet so utterly ineffective in reestablishing the conditions for a new golden age of accumulation. There is no prospect of cheap food returning. Labor productivity growth continues to decelerate. And we have all manner of other difficulties confronted by capital that primitive accumulation has been unable to resolve. And this is a major rupture with the world historical pattern. So if capitalism is to survive, I think the burden of the argument really falls on those who want to say that primitive accumulation has worked. If so, it has worked in the most peculiar way that breaks with the historical pattern. It may well be that the future for at least the next few decades, which promise to be really remarkably turbulent and I think full of possibility, is as well that we are going to see an intensification of this Robin Hood in reverse strategy of neoliberalism, that is taking from the poor and giving to the rich in all different kinds of ways of life. Agriculture is one of them. So, in the time that we have, we're going to take about 20 minutes here, and we're going to talk about this sort of evaporation of neoliberalism's, I think really neoliberalism's greatest accomplishment in some ways was the creation of cheap food on the world market in the absence of a productivity revolution. always before from the English and Dutch agricultural revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries to the American family farm revolution of the late 19th century to green revolutions in the 20th century, cheap food had been realized on a world basis through these great productivity revolutions. As we know, no such productivity revolution has occurred in world agriculture, and in fact, especially since the mid-1980s, we have seen a progressive dilapidation of agriculture's dynamism. It's really been colonized by finance capital in some very peculiar ways, and ways that have really intensified the underlying exhaustion of, say, fertile soil, cheap water, so on and so forth. So recall that between 2001 and 2007, the cheapest food in world history collapsed. By 2007, food prices were the highest since The Economist, the magazine, began tracking such movements in 1846. Well, from there it got worse still. Food prices peaked in the summer of 2008. A new high was reached in the early months of this year. And really, food prices, while they've declined a bit from the peak of earlier this year, they've declined just a bit. And as we know, these are commodity prices, not retail prices. So much of the global south, the situation is much worse than this. And in fact, you can read the business press today. There's a great concern in China over spiraling inflation, which is driven by rising food prices in great part. But it's also a major concern in places like the United States, where it's clear that working class households, by which I mean in a very broad sense, don't have the resources to spend much beyond food and housing and basic survival needs. Well, what accounts for this dramatic reversal in the price of food between 2001 and 2007? The short answer turns on the rise and demise of this world ecological surplus that was enabled by the enclosures of modernity's last frontiers. So recall that neoliberal capitalism emerged and sustained itself by appropriating what free gifts remained for the taking in the 1970s. The oil frontiers of the North Sea, Alaska, West Africa, the crest of green revolution agriculture in South Asia, appropriating and exhausting the fertile soil and cheap water, the integration of the old Soviet bloc into the world market, allowing cheap metals and oils to drive down production costs during the 1990s, the appropriation of the Chinese peasantry as a vast labor surplus, the privatization of state and quasi-state firms and public services. Here's the important thing. These free gifts are not going to come back, okay? These appropriations and privatizations are one-shot deals. They are one-off affairs, okay? This is one of the, I think, the illusions that is underneath a lot of green thought, that somehow, sort of bourgeois green thought, that, well, you know, new sources of technologies can come along to appropriate more of what remains of nature, external nature. Well, what I'm saying here in the big picture is that these last appropriations of historical capitalism mark the closure of the great frontier that was opened in the long 16th century. This great frontier provided an astounding wealth of extra human nature and human nature that reduced production costs, increased profitability, and generally greased the wheels of accumulation for many centuries. Its exhaustion is a turning point in the history of capitalism. The closure of the great frontier removes the central way that capital has dealt with the rising costs of production. Today, frontiers are but drops in the bucket relative to the demands of value accumulation. Here I think of something like soybean frontiers in Latin America, or biodiesel, palm oil frontiers in Southeast Asia. These are really tiny drops in the bucket. Now, they're very significant for the people who are living there. And I think that's part of where this discussion needs to go, is how do we chart strategies of mobilization that follow from this analysis. But even when we look at the land grab in Africa, mostly in Africa today, it is hugely impactful upon the people living there. But there's no promise of a land grab reviving cheap food. And this is a big problem for capital as a whole. Now, there's a lot of fanfare about this because finance capital will end up making a lot of money off of it in the very short run. But finance capital, in order to survive, needs essentially to live in the future, and that space between the future and the present is dramatically narrow. narrowing. So if capitalism today confronts definite limits to the present configuration of accumulation, this is hardly unprecedented. Indeed, the long history of capitalism is one of a long series of revolutions, bourgeois, industrial, agricultural, and other forms that have transcended the seemingly insuperable limits to accumulation. This is not the first era when people were talking about sort of external limits to accumulation. This, of course, finds its classic statement in Malthus's work. Malthus was writing during a period of the progressive deceleration of agricultural productivity growth in the late 18th century. This was a real concern for classical political economy. David Ricardo feared that rising food prices stemming from agricultural stagnation would throttle the industrialization process that was going on in England in the 18 teens and 20s. Okay? Now, as we know, England resolved its problem by saying, okay, America, send us your grain. And then, okay, the rest of the world send us your grain, like in India, where India was exporting grain to England even as tens of millions died. That's the real sort of total history of cheap food. It's not just it's not a mild-mannered process. So from this perspective, we can ask about biotechnology. In what sense does agricultural biotechnology constitute the basis for a new agricultural revolution? Well, in one sense, agrobiotech fits the classic model. Backed by a new intellectual property regime, property regimes are very crucial, agrobiotech has redistributed income amongst farmers and provided some outlet for the absorption of surplus capital. In another sense, agricultural biotech has been an epical failure on the terms that really matter most to capital as a whole. No yield revolution has been forthcoming, even after 15 years of diffusion and experimentation. And without a yield revolution, cheap food is done for. And with it, the promise of a significant revival of world accumulation. Okay. Now, biotechnology has not halted, much less reversed, faltering productivity growth in world agriculture. The slowdown became evident in the mid-1980s, and the trajectory has not been altered one bit by the widespread introduction of genetically modified crops by the mid-1990s. Indeed, agricultural biotech has done little to improve intrinsic yields, intrinsic in the agronomic sense of raising the yield ceiling, in contrast to operational yields, the amount actually harvested. The mounting research on this question, I think especially of Gurry and Sherman's report, but also Ben Brook and others, the mounting research on this question even prompted Monsanto's vice president for public relations to announce, well, look, the main uses of GM crops, I'm quoting here, are to make them insecticide and herbicide tolerant. They don't inherently increase the yield. They protect the yield, he says. Well, alas, Roundup Ready, Monsanto's brand, Roundup Ready crops are not doing much to protect yield lately either. Super weeds, like Superman, super weeds have evolved to survive the onslaught of the famous herbicide, and soy is a particularly revealing case. Considering that biotech soybeans already constitute 57% of world output, and that the US remains the leading soy producer at 37%, the rise of the superweed is something of a world historical event. In the US, especially in soy regions, 10 weed species on millions of acres in 22 states are now immune to the famous herbicide. The American superweed frontier expanded 4 times between 2008 and 2011, that is in just 3 years, to 10 million acres today. And even allowing for some exaggeration in this figure, which is, some projections point to a superweed explosion that would engross 38 million acres over the next 2 years. This amounts to 1 in every 4 row crop acres in US agriculture. It's huge. Well, there's a systemic response that goes back a very long period of time, back to the origins of capitalism, to this kind of problem. It is move the commodity frontier, move soybean production elsewhere. And that's been going on. So what we've seen, of course, is the advance of the soy frontier to Argentina and Brazil. And the Latin American dimension is all the more suggestive of the basic superweed problem, because the soy revolution has been realized not only through the conversion of existing arable land, but also through massive forest clearance and other forms of agricultural expansion. Well, but the soy commodity frontier in Latin America, here's the big problem, has enjoyed little of the historic yield honeymoon, these sort of great booms in yield that accompanied earlier episodes of, say, the sugar frontier in Latin America in the 17th and 18th centuries. The superweeds are advancing faster than agrocapitalism can discipline agriculture. So the problem is that these biophysical natures are evolving faster than the capacity of capital to control them. It's a kind of Darwinian evolution in fast forward. Can capital continue to innovate to stay ahead of this decidedly non-linear treadmill? Well, the experience of 2008 to 10 suggests not, as herbicide resistance developed so rapidly and so powerfully in the United States, the global heartland of GMO agriculture, that even the national media came to feature a growing family of superweeds. So these Roundup Ready crops are at the center of this socio-ecological fast forward. And while it would be unwise to give Monsanto too much credit, the underlying superweed tendency is nevertheless crystallized nicely by the firm's GMO soy. The promise of GMO crops was that declining herbicide and pesticide use and rising operational yields would help farmers. That promise is now quickly turning sour with rising toxification and diminishing returns to agricultural crops. Notwithstanding the claims of Monsanto and the big ag boosters, it appears that glyphosate-resistant crops, that is, crops like glyphosate is the chemical name for Roundup Ready, are bound up with ominous implications for human health, encourage fungal invasions of the root systems of these crops, and now what we're seeing is an apparent exhaustion of the yield gains from Roundup Ready. One farmer told the New York Times, well, we're back to where we were 20 years ago. So what's happening is a widespread reversion to older, more toxic chemical regimes, the reintroduction of, say, 2,4-D, linked to all forms of cancers, especially lymphatic cancers. Theoretically, what I want to highlight is this bundle of contradictions in GMO crops and the superweed effect that pivots on the accelerated evolution of herbicide-resistant weeds what we see is this tension between capital's efforts to control and to commensurate extra-human nature. By commensurate, I mean to treat nature as if extra-human nature, it already treated human nature this way. Capital wants to treat extra-human nature as an interchangeable part. Think of an assembly line, okay? That's how capital, that's how capital sees the rest of nature. This is common sense for anyone who is studying production systems or human labor processes. But in fact, there's a very long history of capital seeking to reduce the rest of nature to this box house, this storehouse of goodies that can be quantified and commensurated with each other. And we should talk more about this because there's a lot of this sort of Cartesianism and efforts to sort of quantify and homogenize the rest of nature, even in green thought. So what I want to highlight is that we are, in a sense, living through a new phase of extra-human nature's revolt against the disciplines of capital. There is what Victor Wallace calls a taming cycle. The more that capital tames, we can put that in quotes, the more that capital seeks to tame natural processes, the more that extra-human nature spins out of human control, provoking new and more aggressive taming measures with increasingly disastrous outcomes. Indeed, that seems to be a signpost of our times. So the superweed effect represents a kind of quantity-quality shift in the history of an enduring contradiction. The long history of agroecological control regimes that began with the monocultures and highly regimented work disciplines of early modern capitalism and the sugar plantations has today crossed a world historical threshold with molecular and other disciplinary projects. This shift is a new era of extra-human nature's resistance in which the short-run fixes not only become progressively shorter run, but also progressively more toxic. So as capital seeks to control the unfolding crisis before our eyes, the control measures are not only something that we would typically talk about in terms of social inequality and social injustice, but also toxification. And I think in this respect, the movements are much ahead of the scholars in this respect. The movements already understand this. This is at the core of environmental justice movements, for instance, worldwide, and the food sovereignty movement as well, that these issues cannot be separated in any neat and tidy way. So in previous eras, capital's need for totalizing control, such as it needs today, was much less, for the sound reason that faltering labor productivity in one zone could be fixed through a new round of global expansion. Problems with England's agricultural productivity in the 18th century, for example, were never resolved within England, but simply farmed out, as it were, to the rest of the world. So the accessibility of sizable frontiers of appropriation in previous eras meant that capital's pursuit of control was more relaxed, its capacity to achieve rising productivity gains greater, and its toxification tendencies weaker than today. This superweed effect overlays and amplifies the resource and soil depletion of capital-intensive agriculture. This is one reason why I really caution against this sort of green neo-Malthusian view of overshoot or peak everything. We need to look at the relations that generate, the relations that historically have enabled a very small amount of labor and capital to set in motion a very large amount of free gifts. I think that we are in an era of peak appropriation. I think that tells us more the how of the present crisis. Even if overshoot and peak everything have very large kernels of truth in them, they tell us very little of how capitalism works today, and the how is everything if we want to transform the system in a more egalitarian and democratic way. So capital agriculture exhausts the soil, demands energy-intensive inputs, and slates its thirst by exhausting groundwater. This much we know. And while there's and this is strongly related to what Marx calls a tendency for the overproduction of machinery to lead to the underproduction of inputs. And I want to talk more about this because the only dominant theory of underproduction among Greens is a neo-Malthusian theory. And it takes the problems of underproduction outside of the relations of power, the socio-ecological relations of power and process. It abstracts from those in dealing with questions of scarcity. And so, while there's an important cyclical moment to this tension between overproduction and underproduction, there is also a cumulative moment, the superweed effect and its non-linear amplification of a long-standing tension between the overproduction of machinery and the underproduction of inputs. Today, the very productivity gains achieved by mechanization and standardization, what Tony Weiss calls the biophysical overrides of cheap oil, are now threatened by their own successes. Underneath the long-run pattern may be a more fundamental shift even still. In contrast to previous eras, neoliberalism's underproduction tendencies emerged first from the progressive cannibalization of its own production and reproductive foundations, thanks to finance capital. A big part of what finance capital has been doing, in a sense, is robbing Peter to pay Paul, theoretically at some point in the future. But it's sort of sustaining profitability and accumulation by sort of cannibalizing not just the rest of the planet, not just workers and peasants and the world's poor, but also by cannibalizing the rest of capital. And so this is exactly what we saw during the 2003 to 08 commodity boom, which, as I've indicated, is still going on, is rising energy prices propelled rising fertilizer and food prices. So neoliberalism's financialization has suppressed the investment mechanism, which might have prolonged the cheap energy regime or the cheap food regime, and really created this new powerful tension within capital itself. So, how do we end this? Well, let's recall, cheap food has always been central to the renewal of vigorous accumulation. It was no coincidence that the Dutch, the British, and the Americans pioneered epoch-making agricultural revolutions that not only fed domestic proletariats cheaply, but provided a model for advanced capitalist agriculture in general, sort of provided a hegemonic vision for how agriculture should be practiced. So the Low Countries were, the English learned how to practice capitalist agriculture in a technical sense from the Dutch, and then the Americans from the English, and then the American model, the family farm model, became the model for the rest of the world. People forget this today, but the Soviets adopted more or less wholesale the American model of agriculture in the 1920s. So we need to think about that. And well, we can be sure of one thing today. The conditions that underpin neoliberalism's signal crisis, the point at which the prices of these big four inputs, but really only cheap labor has survived, the signal crisis at which the price of food, raw materials, and energy begins to move upwards instead of moving downwards has not gone away. We're still, the commodity boom has not gone away. And well, I never do this, but to paraphrase Rupert Murdoch, the solution to the crisis today is $20 a barrel oil instead of $100 a barrel oil, and its analogs for food and raw materials. But this solution doesn't appear to be coming on the horizon. Indeed, and this has a lot to do with financialization and its preference for essentially appropriating, including appropriating the past accomplishments of Fordist capitalism, rather than investing in new productivity revolutions. So, so what we have seen, just to sort of put this into, really to try to drive this home, is that we see the superweed effect not as a narrow issue of certain weeds growing in places like in soybean regions of Illinois or Georgia, or for that matter, in Argentina and Brazil, but rather a new phase of spiraling unpredictability today that we see all over the map, from MRSA staph infections to manifold cancers and autoimmune disorders, to avian and swine flus and other disease vectors as well. We see all over the map a spiraling escalation of extrahuman nature's revolt to the disciplines of capital, manifested in a new era of unpredictability. We see this with the climate as well, of course. That we have passed through another of what the climate scientist Flannery calls a magic gate, which seems not very magic, but quite terrifying. These sort of successive accumulating contradictions that build up and give rise to qualitative and unpredictable shifts. So this is the nature of the era that we're living in. And since the 1970s, finance capital especially has moved so rapidly to appropriate and then to exhaust the conditions of its own reproduction that it is far from clear that capitalism can survive the crises that neoliberalism today is provoking and experiencing. Just to take the most spectacular instance, climate change. Climate change will so dramatically constrain the possibilities for rising labor productivity in agriculture that cheap food is really not going to return. There are few indicators that finance capital will invest in the $45 trillion necessary to halve greenhouse emissions by mid-century. For that matter, it is unclear if finance capital will allow for historically low investment levels in the world oil sector to revive. So it's a very curious situation. The historian Charles Bolles once remarked about the crisis of European feudalism, something that could well apply to the present crisis of late capitalism. To paraphrase, after nearly 4 decades of using nature as collateral for its debt-financed expansion, the bills came due in 2008 with the interlinked commodity boom and near financial meltdown. Finance capital now appears to be doing precisely what Europe's aristocracy attempted to do at the end of the 13th century. Find new ways of extracting wealth from the productive economy, removing the surplus necessary for reinvestment, and in the process, killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can have a 5-minute break, and then we take questions. Is that okay? So we have some time here, so let's take a break. Okay. Or do you prefer to have the questions now? I mean, that was my idea. So what do you
Why don't we
prefer?
take a break? Does that sound good?
Yeah. Yeah. Take a break.
Take away.
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't, does it?
Maybe we need more.
Like the articles.
Yeah. 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 Try to. Yeah. Okay. Great. No problem. Hello. Welcome.
Thank you. I made it. I got it.
Yeah. No problem. So you got half of the presentation.
Yes.
I mean, most of the important things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got. I have been sent for a thing through my mail.
Okay.
I'm supposed to go to South Africa in November.
In November.
Yes.
Okay.
So I got I went to the embassy and I got the thing in my mailbox.
Yeah.
I think the letter.
Okay.
But it came together with many other things and it was in Swedish. So I kept saying, I'll need to read this, I'll need to read this. So finally, yesterday, I called the embassy and I said, where's my passport? They said, we sent it. So I started tracking and I find this paper and I look, I'm like, oh no.
Oh.
And today was the last day to pick it.
Okay.
Otherwise, they would send it back.
Yeah. But where are you from?
Kenya.
Kenya. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just thought, okay, I better go pick it. Otherwise, I'll have to go find the thing or Stockholm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sure. So sorry, I have to go and do
Okay.
something. I am back here.
Actually, the whole PhD is around this idea.
She was saying the biggest problem on food crisis, food prices, high food prices, is that people are failing to pay the new gate price, farm gate price. As long as you fail to pay the farm gate price, that's why people are eating in Western countries are subsidized. Here, people, you cannot grow any food without subsidy. But the issue is they cannot grow here because everything is subsidized. And unfortunately, they're failing to pay the much.
Where that money comes from?
Taxes.
No, it's from other. But this is very interesting. But for me, I wanted to understand what everything what he said, but it's not hard. It's not so easy.
Alright. This is the list. Yeah, yeah, please.
Is that the simultaneous sheet or what?
It's because we have this PhD course.
Yeah.
And then
Jo, det är inte dricka.
But yeah, so it's just an advantage.
Yeah.
If I'm not on the course, I don't.
yeah, I mean, nothing was you are registered, but it's fine. So this kind of next.
Svart te och grönt te. Och det är intressant för kaffe, det är inte båda har samma effekt. Men jag tror att te är nu, det är svårare så jag känner så. Ett sånt som det här är inte att vi har med pris på det här, eller jag vet, men han menade he was talking about the price, of course, and the price is like the labor, blah, blah, blah. But he's talking about the affordability to buy that will make the cost and the price. Because
I didn't know that you were there. I was until they
You were at the studio?
Yes.
Oh,
Yesterday.
yeah, no, I remember. Yeah, you told me you were going to Yeah, oh shit. Because I was there, but you wanted to do it 3 and then what, 3?
But I was there up late, so
Yeah.
I have come to that.
Okay. Oh, don't make all
Are you going to go to Wuhan?
Me too. I don't know when. I have to meet my LCA group.
Oh yeah, me too. It's like, we're going to meet actually we're going together to build a meeting. Doing the same
I'm going to suggest that, but we've only got an hour. Can we sketch all these plants?
I think we're going to have a discussion. Yeah,
I'm not going to sketch though. It's like, okay, I'm going to go and take pictures and look at them, but I'm not going to sketch.
Put these documents, these pictures, and then put notes in.
Yeah. But what are we going to do though? It's like, I can Google search them and look at the pictures.
Google search. See how we get this working. Why these sockets aren't giving me
So let it switch.
More coffee is, I like how much money they have. Or someone bring the coffee.
The formal structure of money collapse.
There is some coffee here. Tea. Tea. Yeah, sure.
About the lecture?
That's right.
The action for the future. That's what I guess we'll discuss that. I mean, I don't think that there's one
most
more
widely
like
distributed
that.
drugs.
Basically,
Okay. Let's start. Please, questions, comments, everything. Where to begin?
Shall we go first? Just a short one. I really liked how you referred to the relationship between humans and nature as
The rest of nature.
the rest of nature, non-dichotomized sort of human nature and extra-human nature, because then that takes away the sort of perceived view that humans are separate from nature. But I also wondered why you, what reasons did you have for referring to extra-human nature as a revolt against capitalism, using that word revolt in a personifying sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. There might be a better term for revolt. But what's clear is that in certain key areas that really matter to the accumulation of capital, extra-human natures are eluding the disciplines of capital that have, in the past, worked very well. And you know, we see this with climate change, we see this with human immune systems, we see this with, well, you can take the herbicide atrazine, which is banned, rightly so, in most of Europe, and was, I believe, first banned in Sweden, at least in the EU, that is an endocrine disruptor and that feminizes masculine frogs. So when we look at what goes on with frogs, and the frogs are just a canary in a coal mine. They're just the first sign of what's going on with the rest of the species on this planet. So we're seeing sort of the accumulating quantitative contradictions like toxification, which is what herbicides are, of course, they're toxification, that are now we're seeing a quantity-quality shift. So there's a qualitative a new moment. We don't know the full extent of this, but it's clear that our era is an era of spiraling unpredictability. And I think that gives us great hope. Patrick was just expressing his sort of pessimism about the situation. But I would say, well, for me, the argument that I make, I feel, is tremendously optimistic because modernity, while I'm a big fan of modernity in many ways, modernity is also a giant killing machine. I mean, you know, we see this with the sixth great extinction of life on this planet that's going on now. And the whole sort of series of sort of mechanized, routinized approaches to the sort of disciplining, torture, repression of vast populations on this planet that's still going on. So, like in here, I won't go too far on the subject, but in neoliberalism is an era of technological stagnation in terms of labor productivity revolutions, but we've seen great advances in the repressive capacities of the system, the surveillance capacities for the system, all the ways of sort of quantifying and monitoring vast populations. What always sticks in my head is when the Guatemalan National Security State switched over to computers, they could then update their records and go and kidnap and kill all the activists that they had missed over the past 20 years. And that's sort of a story that can be extrapolated to many different times and places during the neoliberal era. Now, the good news is that that too is entering into a period of declining returns for capital. No one has shown this better than Naomi Klein. So, and who I think also makes a kind of world ecology argument in identifying the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism as key concepts for our time, because the essence of the shock doctrine isn't, well, here's an ecological disaster here with Katrina and a social disaster here with IMF shocks. They are in fact the same disciplining processes for different expressions of an underlying issue, essentially disciplining and controlling relations of socio-ecological reproduction, of schools, of water, so on and so forth. So personifying, maybe there's a danger in that, I don't know. There might be another way of phrasing that.
It is framed within the larger context of what you present, which for me as a lowly master's student, I've never heard that contextualization before. It's always sort of, especially with the English education system, it's all sort of, we are the teachers, we know what we're talking about, you are the students.
Yeah, it's a knowledge factory.
Yeah, exactly.
At some point we're going to have the discussion, well, what do you do about all this? Well, you're all students, democratize the universities. That's the first thing. The universities are modernist institutions that the bourgeoisies always attempt to dominate, but never quite can. And so and there's this knowledge factory model of, well, here's the professor, and just even you're like, for me, the MA and PhD students are at the heart of any university. I mean, all the students are at the heart of any university. And yet, what the universities are structured to do is to sort of socialize you to accept authority and expertise coming up from on high. So that's the best thing that as students we can all do. As workers, we want to democratize our workplaces. As people living in communities, we want democratic communities. It seems better than, say, driving a hybrid car and screwing in a fluorescent light bulb.
It feels like you can contribute more by doing that.
Yeah, that's the illusion, right? That like, if I take...
There's always a glass ceiling of how far you can actually get from the grass movement sort of perspective.
Well, okay. Yeah. But in general, we want a democratization of these structures of power and dominance that prevail. Yeah, Patrick, and then I think it's...
Yes. Yeah, a little point of view on this discussion you just had, and then I have my own question. But first, yeah, I think, like, if you look at academia, it's, the way it's getting, or it's capitalized right now, it's really shocking and ridiculous. First, for example, that you are, like, I am employed by the Swedish people, they're very nice, they give me a job because they seem to think that it's useful what I'm doing. I write some nice articles, I have to publish them in high-class journals that are normally, of course, capitalistic, and so that means that they sell access to those papers that I publish, where I get paid from the Swedish state. They sell that back to my own university and all the other universities. The work of all the people in the magazine or in the journal is totally unpaid. They're just expected to do that. And then, if somebody comes to the street and says, "Yeah, Patrick, you know, I've been paying you a nice life here in Sweden for 2 years. It would be nice to read what you've written." Then I can answer to him, "Yeah, well, sadly you can't because you don't have a subscription to this journal." So that's yeah, bizarre. So like the first thing that you should do is publish in open access journals, even though they are maybe lower on your scale of whatever.
It's more access to the people who
Yes, because the people who actually,
contribute
the people who actually ask you to do that for them, because they see that as something nice, they should do as a state. They have the possibility to read it. So that's maybe one first step to think further with. And then I have a question: what is this whole thing converging to? What do you think will happen at the end? Like, is it because you say it's optimistic? Yeah, change. This is going to happen, I guess. But is that change that everything is toxic? The earth can only support way less people because the soils are gone and half of them will have to die and the rest will have to live in poverty? Or what's the point? What's the end?
Well, I think that the last part is a big part of what I'm making the argument that we can go about seeing the world as a whole a bit differently. From, well, here's the earth over here and it has a certain capacity, and here are the numbers of people over here. In fact, for one thing, humans are wrapped up with the earth in all sorts of ways that defy that Cartesian preconceptualization. I think that the argument that I am making in its broadest sense is that we want to look at modernity in all its really big constitutive processes, including things like communications revolutions, as these bundles of human and extra-human nature. From that perspective, then we can deal with issues like resource depletion. And I highlight this issue. If we look at the communication and information infrastructures that are in place now, it's unlikely that those can be sustained in anything like their present capacities. So these issues of the information society are not questions that are dematerialized. There is no such thing as anything dematerialized. But on the other hand, it's never very easy to sort of neatly separate out the symbolic and the material. Not for nothing did Marx once call ideas in themselves a material force. So not only do I argue that the human and extra-human relations need to be sort of highlighted in rethinking, say, financialization or colonialism or commodification or scientific revolutions, for that matter, but that also we need to understand capitalism in its fullest register of symbolic and material relations. That ways of seeing the world are absolutely decisive to understanding how we wish to respond to the crises of the present. And if we have a view that says, like mini-greens, well, the financial problem can be fixed over here, and the problem with the climate or the problem with food can be fixed over here, that's absolutely problematic. We need to understand these as interrelated in much more fundamental ways. Now, what many say to me, and rightly so, is, well, we can't do everything at once. And that's precisely my point. That we look at these very specifiable sort of big processes, and everybody doing research at any level is taking one or another of these big processes, whether it's a scientific revolution or an industrial revolution or the rise of mass consumer society, whatever that big process is. Instead of seeing this as a kind of composite where we have society without nature in one box and nature without society in another box, we understand these as ways of organizing, as projects and processes that seek to organize the relation between humans and the rest of nature. This makes a big difference. If we look at, say, the history, labor history, where I started, if we look at the factory as an environment, that makes a big difference. If we look at industrialization as a tension between patterns of family formation and household reproduction and the labor process inside the factory, what I would call the world-ecological perspective, then it looks much different than if we look at what the politics of a particular union were at a particular time. So, well, that's social history. The other stuff is environmental history. What I'm saying is that we take these processes and projects and we move back and forth between what looks like, oh, well, that's certainly social. And then we go over here and we say, well, that's certainly ecological. Well, it turns out once we look at that closer, that's an arbitrary divide, and it's not a helpful divide. When we look at cultures of solidarity in social movements, say among peasants or informalized workers, or even in industrial communities, what we see are ways of valuing the connections between each other and the environment in a very specific way. The environment of the community, the health of children, the health of workers in the process, the relations. It begins to look much more interesting and intricate, and we understand not only in a deeper sense the what and the why, but so importantly the how of how this works. I saw a question. Who was? Go ahead, Felix. Yeah?
Do you think there's like a right way to look at the economy of the world? Like, you have different paradigms looking at things. Do you think there's like a right way, and maybe relate that to Marx? Or?
Well, I think instead of seeing things like, well, that's the economy over here, and that's society over here, and that's culture over here, we need to look at. It's interesting that there's a convergence among a number of perspectives, some relatively new and some longer standing, that say. I mean, look at what sort of cultural materialism says. Cultural materialism, I think, Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and this sort of tradition says, look, economies are irreducibly partial. That we need to understand culture and economy and politics as a whole. That we can't understand these separately from one another. Well, the same is true for the relations, for what I'm calling the relations with the rest of nature. And by that, I include human nature as an active point. I don't mean we just take the box of the social, the cultural, and the political, and sort of shape that, and then see it interacting over here. From Marx's perspective, and I think that this is so useful for doing research, is Marx practiced what Bertel Ohlmann calls the philosophy of internal relations. And so Pareto once lamented about Marx that Marx's words are so slippery that he says bats, but he implies the birds that eat them and the birds and the mice at the same time as a whole. That we understand these in relation to the whole, and the whole includes the active relation with the rest of nature. So I would say instead of the economy, instead of the cultural, we highlight a specific process that we want to look at. And then we draw in insights from people who think they're writing about the economy or the culture or the politics or the environment. And we draw those in and we see how does the world look differently if we put those into conversation with one another. So I remember one time having a discussion with Michael Watts, the famous political ecologist who I worked with, and I said, well, Michael, I want to look at the diaspora of silver, these silver flows that moved from Potosi in the 16th and 17th century all the way into Europe. And he said, well, if you do that, you'll lose sight of the ecological dimension. But in fact, what I found was exactly the opposite, that you could find these transnational processes and think today of something like capital flows or migration flows or forms of imperialism. If we take these as guiding threads that move across national boundaries, that move across different spaces of the world economy, that interweave the very local and the bodily with the very large scale, then and we do this in a way that sort of tacks back and forth, moves back and forth between what looks to be the social, what looks to be the ecological. We're going to see a whole bunch of relations that are hidden from us if we treat nature as going on in one box and society as going on in another.
So don't compartmentalize.
Yeah, because it's really a form of sort of it's undialectical, but it aggregates the parts into a whole. And from a dialectical perspective, this is impermissible. People use a lot of different words to characterize what I do, but for me, it's the relation. You start from the relations. If you start from the relations and move out to the patterns, And we're all studying patterns and how those patterns shift, okay? If we start from the relations and move out, it's easier to understand how if we think of, say, the models of systems ecology and the limits to growth, you've all seen these models where you have boxes like population, industrialization, so on and so forth, and you see all these arrows that move back and forth, right? The problem with that model is that they begin with the boxes and move out to the relations. We need to start with the relations and then see how the boxes are formed and reformed over time. So, society doesn't emerge because it's interacting with nature. The very sort of conceptual vocabulary of this separation between nature and society emerges out of a series of sort of transformative activities of Europe's states, of class struggles in the countryside, of merchant capitalists in the early modern era. This was tightly bound up with the scientific revolution. Not for nothing does Carolyn Merchant, the great environmental historian, call the scientific revolution the era of the death of nature. The death of nature as sort of an active, co-evolving participant in the course of so-called human civilization. And the funny thing for me is that we see the death of nature embodied even in many green analyses. Ecological footprint studies are premised on the idea that nature is something you put your footprint into. It's a passive substrate. It's not an active relation. And if we look at the work of the foundational people in ecological footprint studies, it's a deeply, profoundly neoliberal perspective. Mathis Wackermangel, for instance, talks about market efficiency and optimal allocations. And we can say this about a number of green approaches, that they tend to sort of put the economy in one box and then say, oh, look at all the consequences that this terrible thing, capitalism, has come along and done all these terrible things, or this terrible thing, industrial society, has come along and look at all these consequences. But they never ask, well, how is nature not just consequential, but constitutive of those processes? And if you don't want to use capitalism, I don't care. Talk about industrialization, talk about modernity. I think once we start to look at we start from the relations, it's much more exciting and dynamic and much more helpful to what we're looking at today. Yeah?
Can you articulate a bit more about this technological bourgeois that you were talking about?
The technological stagnation?
Yeah. No, about this technological people who think the technology will change the economy into this sustainable. Because
well,
I think in my best day I'm kind of one of them.
Well, I think here's I remember talking with an Icelandic Marxist colleague of mine, and what I said was, look, the possibilities for the technological possibilities for a sustainable society are latent within capitalism. But capitalism is unable to put those into use. Why? Because ultimately, none of these sort of proposals, solar panels in the Sahara, all these other things, none of them promise to deliver a great new boom of cheap energy or cheap food. Or biotech is in fact one of the crucial responses of capital to attempt a technological fix for the slowdown of accumulation. And what agricultural biotech essentially allowed was a redistribution of power and income from farmers to capital without a yield boom. We can talk more. I think that this is a really crucial point. Oh, before I turn to this, here's the other thing, that the really great sort of epoch-making innovations of modernity, the steamship and the railroad of the 19th century are a great example of this. They worked because they essentially allowed for a radical enlargement of appropriation of the rest of nature. So you could send, not only did the steam engine begin at the pits of coal mines, because it was
hugely wasteful of fuel. But it was used to drain water from coal mines. So once they figured out how to do that, that is how to drain the water so that you could appropriate coal more effectively, then you could deploy it more widely and use that sort of cheap coal, which is not going to repeat itself, you use that cheap coal to then go appropriate especially the food of the rest of the world, but also the labor power of the rest of the world. So the great migrations of the late 19th and early 20th century, Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans to the Americas, but also South and East Asians to everybody was going to the Americas at that point. Those were all possible because of this great technological innovation. And so the shorthand that I use to talk about this is that productivity was always linked to plunder. So there's productivity and plunder. The steamship is a great example of that. The steamship and empire were of a piece.
So you're saying this technological innovations will also lead to another type of plunder?
I'm saying that has been a neoliberal project so far and it's failed. And there doesn't seem to be evidence that there's some vast new frontier. People, well, what about Africa? Well, Africa is not a frontier. Africa is one of the most thoroughly ransacked areas of the planet. People say, well, what about the oceans? The oceans, for one thing, are in the process of dying in some important sense. That's a slight overstatement, but big problems with the oceans. So the oceans have already been used as a frontier, as a waste frontier. And the climate, the atmosphere has been used as a frontier for greenhouse gases. That's maxed out. So, you know, where to next? It's, you know, so why don't we get you in the back and then we'll come back to that.
So, and yeah, this is about agricultural biotechnology as well. I think perhaps scientists and well, Monsanto see this kind of landscape at the genetic level as another opportunity for plunder, if you want to put it that way. Do you think there's no weight to the argument that maybe there could be, like there was a letter just released by a whole lot of plant scientists at the beginning of this month here in Sweden, calling for reduction of regulations, and we're being held back. We have, you know, barriers in front of us and so on, excessive regulation and uncertainty generated by GMOs and so on. Also, I think there's problems with patenting rights, handing control to multinationals and so on. But if all of these were removed, all of these difficulties, we had like public institutions doing research on GMOs. Do you think there's any weight to the argument that there could be opportunities for increased yields or plunder at this level? Or
I mean, that doesn't sound like a new development. I mean, that sounds like what's been in play for 25 years.
Yeah.
And
but
this
is still being played out now. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And look, I mean, finance capital is going to continue to ride this horse until it dies. You know, so this is what's we see this most dramatically in the U.S., but also in the UK, where you know, whether we're talking about the White House or 10 Downing Street, I mean, these are branch offices of finance capital. You know, and they are. I mean, and they're just gonna keep sort of sucking wealth from the rest of the planet until something stops them. So I think what you're talking about is sort of nothing new. But does that sound wrong to you? Is there something new that you're seeing in there?
I guess. Is there? Maybe you would need to ask a geneticist, but is there any opportunity for plunder at the genetic level, or
there seems to be
just finding the right plant variety is going to give us some?
I was really influenced by Vernon Rutan, who was one of the leading agricultural economists of the Green Revolution era, and he said, "Look, what's going on is you can't really increase in order to increase yields more, even if it were possible, you would have to dump in more fertilizer. And we already have declining effectiveness of fertilizer. And what that's going to do is bring in more pests. Okay? So then you have to dump in more herbicides, which is, and we see, world agriculture, at least in the breadbasket, seems to have passed a kind of threshold with toxification. So, yeah, you can go back to older chemical regimes, but there's no new magic bullet.
But then the disturbing thing is you have people at the highest levels of plant science in this country producing a letter like this in a national newspaper which just repeats all of this stuff.
Plant scientists
This
are
month.
notoriously loyal
I guess.
to agricultural capital in one form or another. There are some dissenters. We can think of somebody like Michele Altieri, or Ignacio Chapella, who was eventually tenured at Berkeley, but was a critic of biotech, who was, I mean, they attempted to fire him, and only by heroic struggles did he manage to survive. But those who break from the established orthodoxy are severely punished, especially in vital sectors in sectors that are vital to capital. So, you know, a cultural studies person who goes off and says dissident things, that's one thing. But if a plant scientist says biotech doesn't work, those people are just savage. Patrick, you wanted to get into
yeah, because you have this, you're talking about these ideas of frontier, and yesterday we heard Christian folks talking about cyberspace, or in that case, and there's also this kind of idea about new frontiers, or has been entertained a while, and these ideas about capitalizing on. So how does that fit into your, into this idea about plundering new possibilities?
Well, I think there's a rich world that's typically the domain of cultural studies that I'm not going to speak to. I do think that there are, it's not a frontier in the sense that the internet and the information society and all of that is not a frontier in the sense that it promises the opportunity to revive the sort of accumulation by appropriation of setting in motion nature's free gifts on a massive scale. It is effective. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the computer infrastructure really owes its genesis to both sort of territorialist and police state concerns. There might be a more politic way to put that. And then also, of course, to the financialization of capital. I mean, that's huge. So I would see, but of course, as Marx and Engels remark in the Communist Manifesto, look, these new means of communication and transportation also allow for new strategies of mobilization and resistance and solidarity.
But could it be that way that could you conceptualize it in a way that it's capitalizing the free time that people before had to do something else another day?
Yeah, what free time? I mean, I don't mean that as, that's terribly gone. I really don't mean it by that, but I mean that, yeah, I mean, there is a kind of colonization of mentality that goes on that I can't speak to, but I would say that, I mean, computers have been a remarkable way, especially in the academy, to increase the rate of exploitation, to get, professors and others to do more of the work that used to be performed by the university. So I would locate computerization in terms of a very old-fashioned tendency of capitalism just to increase absolute surplus value, to sort of corral people to produce more and longer and all this. And then there's the colonization of mentalities that we can talk about, but that's a little farther afield from my core concerns.
Okay. I wanted to take the issue of the letter of the scientists here in Sweden, because I mean, they started with this big slogan about food security, right? To argue for more genetically modified organisms, which is actually something that you can analyze from many other points of view, right? And food security has to do also with, well, excess of consumption in some part of the world and with less consumption in other part of the world. So there is a lot of discursivity going on here in that letter. But I wanted to reinforce and engage with your argument, because I researched, for example, salmon aquaculture. And salmon aquaculture is a perfect case to analyze all these contradictions. And just 2 days ago, the New York Times informed about the spread of the ISA virus in the US, which affected the salmon sector in Chile for 3 years ago. And it's mean like 50% of the production disappeared within like 6 months, right? I mean, we have that issue of extra nature acting all the time, but at the same time, they are creating the first genetically modified salmon, which eats is going to grow twice faster, which means that it's twice faster too. So, I mean, we have all this connection, and it's right. I mean, they try to look at the sea as a new source of, profits, but we have all those issues you were mentioning here. So that was a kind of comment to illustrate how it's not just in the land, as you mentioned, it's everywhere. In terms of, but my question is maybe, because just to tell the participants in this course, I mean, I find very interesting in your talk this issue of, bringing ecological concerns, of course, or you maybe don't like the idea of just ecological concern, but just to put the question. And also to see at the interrelation, the totality of social ecological relationship. But you could develop this at the theoretical level, because, I mean, there are many theories today dealing with ecosystems that try to jump into social systems. We have resilient theory. I mean, I would like to discuss that issue because it's so relevant today for our concerns here.
So, to talk about, say, the approach of resilience.
No, on other approaches that try to do something similar. I mean...
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think systems ecology, I mean, this is the approach of the Resilience Center, is extraordinarily promising, and they're headed in the right direction. And I think in many other parts of the humanities and social sciences, they're also sort of grappling, trying to move in this direction of a synthesis. But they're not able to do it because either in the case of the Resilience Center, they understand that the science of nature is important, but they don't understand history. They don't understand the relations of power and capital and nature that are constitutive of modernity. You see this with the ecological regime and metabolism studies of the Vienna School of Fischer-Kowalski and those folks, or of Costanza and the ecological economists. For me, I say, well, I ask like Pierre Bourdieu, what are the decisive stakes of the game? If historical capitalism is in some sense, if there's anything that holds it together in a pattern sense, it is the value relations of capital, the concrete specific manifestations of which are commodification. So that doesn't tell us everything, but it establishes a gravitational center. And people say, well, what about if you're dealing with, culture or politics or those other things? What we see, and there's no one who does this better, I think, than Foucault, is that we understand that there are a variety of homologous forms of value in Marx's sense that appear throughout the civilization. So, and what I mean by that is socio-ecological forms that look like value in terms of quantifying everything into an interchangeable part, but are not in themselves value. So biopower and the quantification of life that Foucault talks about, I think nowhere better than in the lecture Society Must Be Defended. This makes perfect sense to me as a Marxist looking at value relations as the gravitational center of capitalism. Because what he's talking about is essentially treating people as interchangeable parts. And this is, of course, the approach of ecosystem services theory, that we're going to treat the rest of nature as a series of interchangeable parts that can be quantified and then sort of sucked up into the vortex of capital accumulation. I mean, the United Nations doesn't use the language of capital accumulation, but other more sort of safe words of economic growth. This is also really the perspective of the Brundtland Commission. It's just, we're going to sort of, grow our way into sustainability. The danger of not searching for those interconnections, and some of you, many of you even, may come up with a better way of tracing out these interrelations than value theory. Maybe there's a better way, okay? This is my proposal, and it's part of a continuing conversation. But the danger of not looking for those interconnections to see that the crises of climate, of finance, of food, of energy are fundamentally a crisis of value relations on a world scale. The consequence of not finding those interconnections is a retreat into various forms of neo-Malthusianism. This is evident in Joan Martinez-Allier, who, if you read his Journal of Peasant Studies essay, again, there are access issues, but write to him, I'm sure he would send it to you. Sort of lauds the anarchist Emma Goldman for being a Malthusian and dealing with questions of scarcity. This is even the problem with Bellamy Foster, who has really abandoned any interconnection between the crises of capitalism and the crises of the environment, leading to a catastrophist line. The catastrophe is coming. Well, empirically, I agree with much of what he says, but it doesn't really tell us much of the how of how this works.